Nathaniel Blake stared at the vast, empty dining hall of his mansion. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the occasional creak of old wood under the weight of years of neglect. It had been like this for over a decade, since the accident, since that day when everything he'd known, everything he'd loved, had been ripped away in a matter of seconds. His daughter, Claire, gone in an instant, and the life he'd built turned into an endless void of guilt and pain. He looked at the untouched dinner in front of him, the same meal prepared every night but barely touched. A ritual he never fully understood but couldn't let go of. Claire had loved spaghetti. He kept ordering it, as if somehow it would bring her back. Outside, the wind howled through the towering trees surrounding the estate. Nathaniel knew what it felt like to be trapped, to be surrounded by walls too high to escape, even if they were invisible. The wealth he'd accumulated meant nothing to him now, but the house, the routine, the isolation, it was all he had left. That was until he saw her. It had been a cold, rainy afternoon. Nathaniel had ventured into town, something he rarely did anymore. As his driver carefully navigated through the city streets, they passed a park. His eyes caught a glimpse of a girl sitting on a bench, soaked to the bone, clutching a thin blanket around her shoulders. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her hair, wet and clinging to her face, hid her features, but there was something in the way she sat, curled in on herself, her body language screaming of defeat. She reminded him of Claire. Without thinking, Nathaniel ordered the car to stop. His driver, confused but obedient, pulled over. Nathaniel stepped out into the rain, approaching the girl slowly, unsure of what to say or why he was even doing this. Maybe it was the emptiness in her eyes or the way she didn't even flinch when he stood before her, towering over her frail form. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice rough from lack of use. The girl looked up, blinking through the rain. Her eyes, wide and frightened, searched his face for a moment before she spoke. I'm fine." But she wasn't. It was clear from her hollow cheeks and trembling hands. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather," Nathaniel pressed, though his tone was more gentle now, less demanding. "Do you have somewhere to go?" She hesitated, glancing down at her soaked shoes. "No," she whispered. "Nowhere." Something inside him shifted, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a pull of responsibility, of purpose. For so long, he had been numb, consumed by his own grief. But now, staring at this broken girl, something in him awoke. An opportunity, perhaps, to make things right, to do something good. Maybe, just maybe, by helping her, he could find some semblance of redemption. "What's your name?" he asked, taking off his coat and draping it over her shoulders. "Emily," she answered softly, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Emily," he repeated, feeling the name on his lips. "I can help you. Come with me." The offer lingered between them, hanging in the air. For a moment, Nathaniel thought she might refuse, that she would retreat into whatever world of shadows she had built for herself. But then she nodded, just once, her body too exhausted to resist any longer. Nathaniel led her to the car, opening the door and helping her inside. His driver shot him a questioning glance through the rearview mirror, but said nothing as Nathaniel climbed in beside her. The rain pattered against the windows as they drove back to the mansion, the sound strangely soothing. Neither of them spoke during the drive, and Nathaniel found himself lost in thought. What was he doing? Bringing a stranger into his home? For years, he had shut the world out, but now, in the silence of the car, he realized how desperate he was for some form of connection, even if it was with a lost soul like Emily. Maybe it was more for him than for her. When they arrived at the mansion, Emily's eyes widened, the grandeur of the estate overwhelming her. She hesitated at the door, looking up at Nathaniel as if she couldn't quite believe this was real. "Come on," he encouraged gently, leading her inside. The warmth of the house hit them both, and Emily shivered, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming strangeness of it all. Nathaniel could see the confusion in her eyes, the fear that this might be some kind of cruel joke. But he meant every word he said. "You can stay here," Nathaniel said, his voice steady as they stood in the grand entrance hall. "For as long as you need." There's no rush. Emily looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and suspicion. She didn't know what to say. In her world, kindness like this didn't exist without a price. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Nathaniel paused, unsure of how to answer that question himself. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," he finally said, his gaze softening. "And sometimes people deserve a second chance." Emily didn't respond right away, but something in her seemed to relax, just slightly. Maybe it was the warmth of the house or the sincerity in Nathaniel's words, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. As they stood there, in the quiet of the grand mansion, neither of them knew just how intertwined their fates had become, and neither could foresee the dark secrets that were soon to surface. The connection between Nathaniel and Emily had begun. The first night Emily spent in Nathaniel's mansion was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The bed was soft, far too soft compared to the cold, hard benches she had become accustomed to. Her body sank into the plush mattress, but despite the comfort, sleep didn't come easily. The silence of the house was eerie. No street noise, no distant chatter, no blaring car horns. Just an unsettling quiet. She lay there, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the coldness of the life she'd been living. It was hard to believe she was here, in this grand place, with someone offering her more than a few coins or a temporary shelter. But why? Why had Nathaniel helped her? What did he see in her? She rolled over, pulling the blankets tighter around her as a sense of unease settled in her chest. Nothing in her life had ever come for free. There was always a cost, and she feared the moment she'd have to pay for this kindness. The following morning, Nathaniel found her already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked fragile, even more so in the soft morning light. He hadn't expected her to be up so early, but something about her posture, rigid, as though she were bracing for bad news, tugged at something inside him. "I hope you slept well," he said softly, leaning against the doorframe. He was trying to ease her into the day, trying not to make her feel trapped by his hospitality. Emily glanced up at him, her eyes clouded with doubt. "It was different," she replied cautiously. "I'm not used to this kind of comfort." Nathaniel nodded, understanding all too well how unfamiliar the world of luxury could feel to someone used to scraping by. "Take your time. There's no rush to adjust. This is your home now, for as long as you need it to be." Emily's gaze flickered with uncertainty. His words were kind, but they held a weight that made her nervous. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, echoing the question she'd posed the night before. "I don't understand." Nathaniel exhaled, stepping further into the room, his hands sliding into his pockets as he considered how to answer. "I told you yesterday," he began, his voice low but steady. "I know what it's like to lose everything. Helping you, it's not about charity. It's about giving someone a chance when life's taken too much from them. Maybe," he hesitated, his eyes drifting to the window where the sunlight filtered in. "Maybe I'm trying to give myself a chance too." The confession hung in the air between them. Emily didn't know what to say. She could sense there was more to his story, something deep and painful, but it wasn't her place to pry. Not yet, at least. Nathaniel shifted slightly, breaking the silence. "There's breakfast downstairs, whenever you're ready," he said. "You don't have to eat alone. You're welcome to join me." Emily gave a small nod, not entirely sure how to navigate the situation. But the prospect of a warm meal was too tempting to refuse. She hadn't eaten properly in days, surviving mostly on scraps. "Okay," she said quietly, rising to her feet. As they walked downstairs together, the grandness of the house felt even more overwhelming in the daylight. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and every piece of furniture seemed meticulously placed, as though the mansion had once been the centerpiece of a life filled with parties, laughter, and joy. Now, however, it felt hollow, as though the house itself mourned the loss of something precious. Emily's footsteps echoed as they entered the dining room. A long table stretched out before her, already set with more food than she could have ever imagined. Fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. It was a banquet compared to the meager meals she'd been accustomed to, and for a moment, she just stood there, frozen in place. Nathaniel noticed her hesitation. "Please sit," he encouraged gently, pulling out a chair for her. "Eat whatever you like." Emily sat down, her movements slow, cautious. The sight of the food made her stomach growl, and despite her nerves, she couldn't resist. She took a piece of toast, her hands trembling slightly as she spread butter on it. Nathaniel watched her, making an effort not to overwhelm her with conversation. He wanted her to feel at ease, but he could see the wariness in her every movement. After a few moments of silence, Emily finally spoke. "It's been a long time since I've had breakfast like this." Nathaniel nodded, not pushing for details. He didn't need to. He could see the weight of her past in her eyes, the same weight that he carried every day since Claire's death. "You don't have to talk about anything you're not ready for," Nathaniel said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I know how hard it can be to trust again after everything." Emily looked at him, her guard slowly lowering. There was something about Nathaniel that felt safe. He wasn't pushing her for answers, wasn't demanding anything in return for his kindness. It was strange, and it made her uneasy, but it also made her want to believe that maybe, just maybe, there were still good people in the world. The meal continued quietly, but there was a growing sense of comfort between them, like two strangers who had silently agreed to leave the past where it belonged, at least for now. Later, Nathaniel showed her around the mansion. The tour was brief, as most of the rooms were rarely used. It was a strange paradox, this enormous house, filled with beauty and grandeur, yet so lifeless. Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for Nathaniel. For all his wealth, it was clear he lived in a prison of his own making. When they reached the end of the hallway, Nathaniel hesitated before opening the last door. "This was my daughter's room," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Emily froze. The mention of his daughter sent a chill down her spine. She hadn't expected him to share something so personal, not so soon. But Nathaniel pushed the door open, revealing a room frozen in time. It was immaculate, untouched, as if Claire had only just left for the day and would return at any moment. The bed was made, books lined the shelves, and a collection of stuffed animals sat neatly on a chair by the window. Nathaniel didn't step inside. He stood at the threshold, his hand gripping the doorknob tightly. "She was only 16 when she died," he whispered. "It was an accident. I couldn't protect her." The words hung in the air, heavy with sorrow. Emily stood beside him, not knowing what to say. She glanced into the room, her heart aching not just for Nathaniel's loss, but for the way he carried it, like a burden he could never set down. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nathaniel didn't respond. He couldn't. The pain was too raw, even after all these years. He closed the door softly, sealing the room and the memories back inside. As they walked away, Emily felt the weight of his grief pressing down on her. In that moment, she understood that Nathaniel wasn't just offering her a place to stay. He was searching for something, perhaps salvation, perhaps forgiveness. She wasn't sure what role she played in that, but one thing was clear. This house, with all its grandeur, was as much a prison for him as the streets had been for her. Their connection deepened, built on shared pain, even if neither of them fully understood the depths of it yet. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Emily began to settle into the rhythm of life at Nathaniel's mansion. The grand, empty halls that once felt cold and imposing were becoming more familiar to her. Yet, despite the growing comfort, there was always an undercurrent of tension. Neither she nor Nathaniel had fully addressed the weight of their shared silences. The ghosts of their pasts lingered in every corner of the house. Emily, for her part, kept her distance emotionally, afraid of asking too much or revealing too little. But there were moments, fleeting and quiet, where she would catch Nathaniel staring off into the distance, lost in thought, his mind far away in some memory that seemed to haunt him. He would pull himself back, shake his head as if to clear it, and return to the present, offering her a small, tired smile. It was in these moments that she realized how fragile he was beneath his wealth and stoic demeanor. One afternoon, as Nathaniel sat at his desk in the study, absently flipping through papers he had no real interest in. Emily wandered the mansion, as she often did. She found herself drawn to the far end of the house, a wing she had not yet fully explored. The halls were quieter here, dustier, as if time had forgotten these rooms. She passed by several closed doors until one, slightly ajar, caught her attention. Inside, the faint scent of lavender still lingered in the air, though the room had clearly been untouched for years. Emily hesitated at the threshold, unsure if she was intruding, but curiosity got the better of her. She stepped inside. It was a room that felt lived in, warm. The bed was perfectly made, a thick quilt folded neatly at the foot. A desk sat near the window, stacked with old textbooks and journals, and next to it, a bookshelf filled with novels and trinkets. Emily's fingers traced the edges of the desk, her eyes settling on a framed photograph that sat, slightly tilted, in the corner. The image was of a young girl, no more than 16, smiling brightly at the camera. Her eyes were full of life, her expression carefree, as if the world was hers to conquer. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to ask who this was. She already knew. Claire. The room exuded her presence, and it was almost as if Emily could hear the echoes of laughter, the faint sound of a life that had once been filled with hope and promise. She gently picked up the photo, her thumb brushing against the glass. She wondered what kind of person Claire had been, what dreams she had, and what it must have felt like for Nathaniel to lose her so suddenly. As Emily stood there, lost in thought, a voice startled her from behind. That was her favorite room. She turned quickly to find Nathaniel standing in the doorway, his face shadowed with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Pain, sorrow, and something else, maybe regret. He stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on the photo in her hands. Claire spent hours in here, he continued, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. Reading, studying, listening to music. This was her sanctuary. Emily gently placed the photograph back on the desk, feeling the weight of his grief settle between them. She seems like she was full of life, she said softly. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes glistening with a mixture of pride and sadness. She was. She had this energy, this light about her that made everything seem possible. He paused, his hands clenching slightly as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. And I lost her. The rawness of his confession hit Emily hard. For all the time they had spent together, Nathaniel rarely opened up about his daughter. It was as if he had locked that part of himself away, too painful to confront. But here, in this room, the walls he had built around his grief seemed to crack. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, though the words felt inadequate. Nathaniel shook his head, as if trying to dismiss the sympathy. "It's not your fault," he replied, his voice tight. "It's mine. I should have been there that day. I should have protected her." Emily took a step closer, sensing the depth of his guilt. "Nathaniel, it wasn't your fault," she said, her voice firmer now. "You couldn't have known." But Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You don't understand. I wasn't there. I was too busy, too caught up in my work, in everything else. If I had just paid more attention, if I had just been a better father, maybe she'd still be here." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Emily could feel the weight of his regret, the way it had consumed him over the years, turning his mansion into a tomb of memories. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that nothing he could have done would have changed the outcome, but she knew that words wouldn't be enough. Guilt like his wasn't easily assuaged. They stood there for a long moment, the quiet of the room pressing down on them both. Finally, Nathaniel exhaled a long, shaky breath. "I haven't been in here since the funeral," he admitted. "I couldn't bear it." Emily glanced around the room, seeing it through his eyes now, the fragments of a life that had been cut short. The stuffed animals on the chair, the books Claire had probably been halfway through reading. It was all frozen in time, untouched by the years that had passed. "I thought if I kept everything the way it was, maybe—" His voice faltered, and he shook his head, as if the thought was too absurd to finish. "But that's not how life works, is it?" Emily didn't know how to respond. There was nothing she could say that would ease the pain he felt. But she understood that, in his own way, Nathaniel had been just as lost as she was, both of them wandering through their grief, trying to find something or someone to hold on to. Nathaniel turned away from the room, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his memories. "I shouldn't have brought you in here," he muttered. "It's not fair to you." Emily watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. She stood there for a moment longer, looking around at the room that had once been filled with so much life, and she realized something. Nathaniel wasn't the only one haunted by ghosts. She had her own, buried deep, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, the two of them were more alike than she had thought. The shadows of Nathaniel's past had begun to emerge, and with them, the fragile connection between him and Emily deepened. But as they both knew, the past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. The days passed, and the quiet tension between Emily and Nathaniel grew, each of them navigating their own grief in silence. Though they spoke little of the past, it hung heavy in the air, always present, yet never directly addressed. Nathaniel spent more time in his study, buried in old documents and memories, while Emily found herself wandering through the mansion, feeling both lost and tethered to this place. It was on one of these nights, while Emily was lying in bed, that she first heard it. A faint sound, so soft it could have been mistaken for the creak of the old house or the wind brushing against the windows. But as she lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness, the sound came again. This time, clearer. Laughter. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A child's laughter, high-pitched and innocent, echoing through the stillness of the mansion. Emily sat up in bed, her heart suddenly racing. The sound chilled her, not because it was menacing, but because it was so impossibly out of place. There were no children in the house, no one else but her and Nathaniel. She threw off the covers and slid out of bed, her bare feet padding quietly across the cold floor. The house was eerily silent now, the laughter gone as suddenly as it had appeared. Emily hesitated at her door, listening, waiting. Nothing, only the creaking of the old house, as if mocking her for being so on edge. Emily shook her head, chastising herself. "It's just your imagination," she thought. This place, this enormous, empty house, played tricks on the mind. She was sure of it. She was alone, vulnerable, and her brain was filling the silence with things that weren't there. Taking a deep breath, she climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around herself, determined to shake the unsettling feeling. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through her window, Emily convinced herself that it had been a dream. A strange, vivid dream born out of the mansion's vast emptiness. She didn't mention it to Nathaniel. There was no reason to. But 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, the laughter was louder, clearer, almost as if it were coming from the room next door. Emily's pulse quickened as she listened, the sound sending chills down her spine. She sat up in bed, gripping the sheets, her eyes darting toward the door. Her instincts told her to stay put, to ignore it and pretend she hadn't heard anything. But curiosity, mixed with fear, urged her to move. Slowly, she slipped out of bed and padded across the floor, her footsteps barely making a sound. She reached the door and opened it cautiously, peeking into the dark hallway. The laughter seemed to fade, growing distant again, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within the house. Emily stepped into the hall, the cold air wrapping around her like a shroud. The mansion felt different at night, more alive, as if the walls themselves were watching her. She moved slowly, her breath shallow, following the faint sound that seemed to drift further away with each step. She found herself at the far end of the corridor, standing before a familiar door. Claire's room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, staring at the closed door. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a heavy silence. Emily's hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. Something in her screamed not to open it, not to disturb whatever memories lay behind that door. But another part of her, curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper, pushed her forward. She turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it the last time she'd been there. Everything in place, untouched. The bed, the books, the stuffed animals, all frozen in time. Emily stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room, half expecting to see something out of the ordinary. But there was nothing, just the remnants of a life long gone. Emily exhaled, feeling foolish for letting her imagination get the better of her. "There's nothing here," she told herself. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. The photograph of Claire on the desk, it had moved. She was certain of it. The last time she'd seen it, it had been angled slightly to the left, almost off-center. Now, it was perfectly straight, positioned as if someone had deliberately adjusted it. A chill ran down Emily's spine. This can't be right. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. Did Nathaniel come in here? Did he move it? The thought was unsettling. Nathaniel had told her he hadn't set foot in this room since the funeral. So how had the photo moved? The sound of footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She turned sharply, her heart thudding in her chest, but the hallway was empty. The house was playing tricks on her again. She was sure of it. But this time, the feeling was stronger, more real. By the time she returned to her room, she was trembling. She climbed back into bed, her mind racing with possibilities she didn't want to consider. Something wasn't right. The laughter, the photo. It wasn't just her imagination. Something else was happening in this house, something she couldn't explain. But how could she bring it up to Nathaniel without sounding crazy? Over breakfast the next morning, Emily sat across from Nathaniel, her eyes flicking nervously to the darkened corners of the room. Nathaniel noticed her unease, his brow furrowing slightly. "You look tired," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you sleeping all right?" Emily hesitated, her fork pausing over her plate. I've been hearing things," she admitted quietly. "At night. It sounds like someone laughing." Nathaniel froze, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, his expression was unreadable, and then a shadow passed over his face. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. "You heard laughter?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, her pulse quickening. "Yes, it's faint, but it sounds like a child." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, distant. "It's just the house," he said. "Old places like this make noises. You'll get used to it." But there was something in his tone, something evasive, almost defensive, that made Emily's stomach twist with doubt. She knew he was lying. He had heard it too. He just didn't want to admit it. Emily dropped her fork, pushing her plate away as the weight of her unease settled in. Nathaniel stood abruptly, muttering something about work as he left the room. Emily watched him go, her heart heavy with suspicion. Something was wrong in this house, and whatever it was, Nathaniel was hiding it. The once faint feeling of dread had begun to take shape, and the cracks in Nathaniel's calm demeanor were starting to show. But Emily had no idea just how deep those cracks would go. The tension between Emily and Nathaniel continued to thicken after that morning. Though neither of them directly addressed it, the silence had shifted into something more strained, more unsettling. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Nathaniel was hiding something tied to the laughter she kept hearing. But the more she tried to probe, the more distant Nathaniel became, retreating deeper into his own world. One evening, after dinner, Emily found herself pacing in her room, restless. The laughter hadn't returned in the last few nights, but the eerie stillness of the mansion had become suffocating. She had spent hours trying to distract herself, but her thoughts always circled back to the same unsettling questions. What was Nathaniel hiding? What had happened in this house? She needed answers. Driven by a growing sense of dread, Emily made a decision. If Nathaniel wouldn't tell her the truth, she would have to find it herself. That night, after Nathaniel retired to his study, Emily slipped out of her room, moving quietly through the darkened hallways. The house was vast, full of hidden corners and rooms she hadn't yet explored. But her destination was clear: Nathaniel's study. She had never entered it without his permission before, but tonight, she had no choice. Something inside her told her that whatever was happening in the house, the answers lay in there. She reached the heavy wooden door and hesitated for a moment, listening. Faintly, she could hear Nathaniel's footsteps upstairs, pacing back and forth. Good, she thought. He's distracted. Emily pushed the door open, her heart pounding. The study was dimly lit, with a fire crackling in the hearth. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty volumes and papers. The room had a warmth to it, but tonight, it felt different. There was an air of secrecy here, something hidden beneath the surface. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. But then, something caught her attention. A large wooden desk in the corner. Papers were strewn across it, but one particular document, half hidden under a stack of books, seemed to stand out. It was a letter, its edges worn and yellowed with age. Emily approached the desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled the letter from beneath the pile. The handwriting was elegant, almost too perfect, but what immediately grabbed her attention was the name at the bottom of the page. Claire. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was a letter from Claire, written to Nathaniel years ago. The ink had faded in places, but the words were still legible. Emily's eyes darted across the page, absorbing every word. Dad, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need you to understand how much I'm struggling. You're never here, and when you are, it's like you're a million miles away. I know you're hurting, but I am too. Sometimes, I feel like I'm just a ghost in this house, and no matter what I do, I can't reach you. I wish you would see me, really see me, before it's too late. The letter ended abruptly, as if Claire hadn't finished writing it. Emily's hands shook as she held the fragile paper. Claire had been reaching out for help, desperate for her father's attention, but Nathaniel had been too consumed by his own grief to notice. As Emily stood there, the weight of the letter pressing down on her, she heard something, a faint creak. Her pulse quickened as she looked around the room, but there was no one there. The house was playing tricks on her again. She stuffed the letter into her pocket, her mind racing. What else had Nathaniel been hiding from her? What had happened to Claire in the days leading up to her death? Determined to find more answers, Emily searched the study, her fingers skimming over books and papers, looking for anything that might shed light on the mystery. She found old photographs, some of Nathaniel and Claire, smiling together, back when they were happy. But there were also photographs of Claire alone, her smile fading in each one, until the last photo showed her standing in the garden, her face solemn, almost haunted. Emily's heart clenched as she looked at the image. Something had happened to Claire in this house. Something dark, something that Nathaniel had buried deep. Her hand brushed against the edge of a drawer, and she instinctively pulled it open. Inside, there was a small, leather-bound journal. It was old, the pages yellowed with time, and when she opened it, the first page was dated nearly 10 years ago, right around the time of Claire's death. The journal belonged to Nathaniel. Emily's breath caught as she began reading the entries, each one more disturbing than the last. The early entries were filled with grief, Nathaniel's pain over losing Claire bleeding onto every page. But as the entries continued, they became darker, more erratic. He wrote about hearing Claire's voice, seeing her out of the corner of his eye, feeling her presence in the house. He wrote about the laughter, the same laughter Emily had been hearing. She's still here. I know she's still here. Every night, I hear her laughing, just like she used to. But when I look for her, she's gone. I can't explain it, but I know she hasn't left me. She's trying to tell me something. Emily's hands trembled as she read the words. Nathaniel had been haunted by Claire for years, tormented by the guilt of her death. And now, Emily was beginning to feel the same presence. The laughter, the movement of the photograph. It wasn't just her imagination. Claire's spirit, or something tied to her, was still in this house. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind her, and Emily's blood ran cold. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest, and found herself face to face with Nathaniel. His eyes locked onto the journal in her hands, his expression hardening. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low, but there was an edge to it, an anger he couldn't quite conceal. Emily swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the journal. "I needed answers," she said, her voice shaking. "You've been hiding things from me, Nathaniel. About Claire, about what happened to her." Nathaniel's face darkened, and he took a step closer, his jaw clenched. You had no right to go through my things. You weren't going to tell me, Emily shot back, her voice rising. I've been hearing her, Nathaniel. The laughter, the presence in this house. She's still here, isn't she? That's why you've been so secretive. You're afraid to admit it. Nathaniel's eyes blazed with a mixture of anger and pain. For a moment, Emily thought he might lash out, but then his shoulders sagged, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. He looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's real anymore. The admission hung in the air, and Emily's heart ached for him. He had been carrying this burden alone for so long, trapped in a prison of his own guilt and grief. But now, they were both entangled in whatever was haunting the house and Claire. I'm not imagining this, Emily said softly. Something's happening here, and we need to figure out what it is. Nathaniel didn't respond at first. He just stared at the fire, the flickering flames reflecting in his haunted eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. I thought I could live with it, he said, but it's getting worse. I hear her every night, laughing, calling out to me. I thought it was just my guilt, my mind playing tricks on me. But if you're hearing it too, his voice trailed off, his eyes filled with a fear that made Emily's skin crawl. They stood there, both caught in the same terrifying realization. Claire's ghost, or something far more sinister, was still in the house, and it wasn't going to rest until the truth came out. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling quiet between Emily and Nathaniel. They were no longer just coexisting in the mansion. Now, they were both aware of the darkness that lingered around them. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker, as if the house itself was waiting for something. For answers, for closure, for the truth to finally come to light. Nathaniel had barely spoken since that night in the study. He kept to himself, retreating deeper into his isolation, while Emily wrestled with the knowledge she had uncovered. Claire's ghost, or whatever presence still lingered in the house, was not just a figment of Nathaniel's grief-stricken imagination. Emily had felt it, heard it, and the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Something terrible had happened in this house, and she wasn't sure if Nathaniel had told her everything. One afternoon, as the sky darkened with a brewing storm, Emily decided she couldn't stand the silence any longer. She found Nathaniel in the living room, sitting by the window, staring blankly at the pouring rain. The sound of the heavy droplets hitting the glass was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, but Nathaniel's expression was distant, lost in thoughts she couldn't reach. We can't ignore this anymore, Emily said quietly as she stepped into the room. Nathaniel didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. For a moment, she thought he hadn't heard her, but then he spoke, his voice flat and resigned. I'm not ignoring it, he murmured. I've tried. For years, I've tried to forget, to bury everything, but it keeps coming back, no matter what I do. Emily moved closer, her heart pounding in her chest. There's more to this, isn't there? Something you haven't told me. Something you've been hiding. Nathaniel finally turned to look at her, his eyes shadowed with guilt. What do you want me to say, Emily? That I failed her? That I wasn't there when she needed me the most? I've told you everything that matters. No, Emily insisted, her voice firmer now. You've told me what you think matters. But there's more. I know there is. Nathaniel's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Emily thought he might walk away, might retreat into that cold, impenetrable shell he always seemed to hide behind. But instead, he sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. There's nothing I can say that will change what happened, he said bitterly. Claire is gone. She's dead, and it's my fault. That's all there is to it. Emily shook her head, stepping closer, refusing to let him pull away. You told me she died in an accident, but that doesn't explain the things that are happening here. The laughter, the strange presence. What really happened that day, Nathaniel? Why do you blame yourself? Nathaniel's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or shame. You wouldn't understand. Then make me understand, Emily urged, her voice softening. You've been carrying this burden for so long, and it's tearing you apart. Whatever happened, you can't keep it locked inside anymore. For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing. He just stared at her, his face a mask of conflict, before finally, his shoulders slumped and the fight seemed to drain out of him. "You're right," he whispered. "I haven't told you everything." The confession hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken weight. Emily's heart raced as she waited for him to continue, knowing that whatever he was about to reveal would change everything. "I was supposed to pick her up that day," Nathaniel began, his voice low, barely audible over the rain. "From school. We had been distant for months. She was angry with me, and I didn't know how to reach her. I thought maybe if we spent some time together, I could fix things." His eyes clouded with pain as he spoke, his hands gripping the arms of the chair tightly. "But I got caught up with work. There was a meeting, something important, or at least it seemed important at the time. I told her I'd be late, that I'd come by after. But," he swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion, "she decided to walk home. I didn't know. She was always so careful, so cautious. But that day, it started raining, and the roads were slick. She was hit by a car just a few blocks from here." Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she listened, the weight of Nathaniel's guilt pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. "Nathaniel, I'm so sorry. I should have been there," he said, his voice breaking. "If I had just kept my word, if I hadn't been so wrapped up in my own life, maybe she wouldn't have." His words trailed off, and for a long time, the only sound in the room was the relentless rain beating against the windows. Emily stood there, watching him, her heart aching for the man who had spent years torturing himself over the one moment he couldn't take back. But even as she felt his pain, something still didn't sit right with her. The accident, the guilt. It explained Nathaniel's grief, but it didn't explain the strange occurrences in the house. It didn't explain Claire's lingering presence, the laughter that haunted the halls. "There's something else," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something you're still not telling me." Nathaniel looked up at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of frustration and helplessness. "What more do you want, Emily? I've told you the truth." "No," Emily insisted. "You've told me the facts. But what about the rest? Why do you hear her? Why do I hear her?" Nathaniel shook his head, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the memories. "I don't know," he said, his voice strained. "I've asked myself the same thing 1,000 times. Maybe it's my guilt. Maybe I'm losing my mind." Emily didn't believe that. There was more. Something deeper. Something hidden beneath the surface of his grief. And she was determined to find it. That night, after Nathaniel had retreated to his room, Emily found herself once again drawn to the far end of the house. The hallway leading to Claire's room seemed darker than usual, the shadows longer, more menacing. But she pressed on, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the closed door. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The room was exactly as she had left it before, frozen in time, a perfect snapshot of a life cut short. But something felt different. The air was colder, the silence heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Emily stepped inside, her eyes drawn to the photograph of Claire on the desk. She reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the frame, and that's when she felt it, a presence, faint but unmistakable. It was like a chill, running down her spine, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and that's when she saw it. The mirror on the far wall, once fogged with dust, was now clear enough to see her own reflection. But as she stared, she realized she wasn't alone. Standing just behind her, in the reflection, was the faint outline of a figure. A girl. Claire. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place as she stared at the image. It was Claire, her face pale, her eyes wide and filled with a sadness that pierced through Emily like a knife. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, Claire was gone. The mirror was once again fogged with dust, as if nothing had ever been there. But Emily knew what she had seen. She stumbled back, her mind racing, her heart pounding. Claire wasn't just a ghost haunting the house. She was trying to communicate, to reach out. And Emily had a terrifying realization. The accident hadn't been an accident at all. Emily's world had been shaken. The truth she had uncovered was far darker than she could have ever imagined. And now, she had no choice but to confront Nathaniel with what she had seen. Because Claire's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mystery. And Emily was determined to solve it, no matter the cost. Emily could barely breathe as she stormed down the long, dark hallway toward Nathaniel's room. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with the image of Claire in the mirror. The house had always felt eerie, but now the haunting had taken a darker, more terrifying form. Claire's death wasn't an accident. Emily was sure of it now. And whatever had happened, Nathaniel was either hiding the truth or had been blind to it. She reached Nathaniel's door and paused, her hand hovering just above the polished wood. Her pulse quickened, 1,000 doubts rushing through her mind. Could she really confront him about this? Did he even know the full truth, or was he just as lost as she was? But there was no going back. She had to know. Without knocking, Emily pushed the door open. Nathaniel was sitting at his desk, his back to her, staring out the window at the storm raging outside. The room was dimly lit, the fire in the hearth barely flickering, casting long shadows across the walls. "Nathaniel," she called out, her voice strained. He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense. "It's late, Emily," he said quietly, his tone weary. "What is it?" Emily took a step inside, her hands trembling at her sides. "We need to talk." Nathaniel's silence was heavy, but after a moment, he sighed and turned to face her, his expression exhausted. "About what?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. "About Claire," Emily said, her voice firmer now. She met his gaze, unwilling to back down. "I saw her tonight." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "What do you mean, you saw her?" "In her room," Emily continued, her voice trembling. "I went in there, and she was in the mirror. Just for a second, but I know what I saw." Nathaniel's face paled, and he looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "It's just your imagination, Emily. This house, it does things to you. It makes you see things that aren't there." "No," Emily said, her voice rising. "This wasn't my imagination. She's trying to tell me something, Nathaniel. There's something more to her death. It wasn't an accident, was it?" Nathaniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice suddenly sharp. "Of course it was an accident. I told you, she was hit by a car. Then why is she still here?" Emily shot back, her chest heaving with emotion. "Why is her spirit trapped in this house, trying to reach out to us? There's something you're not telling me. Something you don't want to admit." Nathaniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he glared at her. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice shaking with anger. "You weren't there. You didn't know her. You don't get to come into my life and tell me what happened to my daughter." Emily flinched but held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I know what I saw, Nathaniel," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "And I know you've been hearing her too. You're just too afraid to face the truth." Nathaniel's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice strained. "You think you know, but you don't. You don't know what it's like to lose a child, to carry that guilt every single day." Emily's heart ached for him, but she couldn't back down now. She needed answers, and she knew Nathaniel was the only one who could give them to her. "Maybe I don't understand that kind of pain," she admitted softly, "but I know what it's like to live with something unresolved, to feel like the past is haunting you because you never got the truth." Nathaniel stopped pacing, his back to her, his shoulders tense. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire and the rain beating against the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "There's nothing you can do, Emily," he said, his tone hollow. "Claire is gone. I failed her. That's all there is to it." Emily took a step closer, her heart pounding. "But what if it's not just about you, Nathaniel? What if Claire is still here because something was left unfinished? What if she's trying to tell you something?" Nathaniel shook his head, his voice shaking. You think I haven't asked myself that? You think I haven't spent every waking moment wondering what I missed? What I could have done differently? But it doesn't matter. She's dead, and nothing will bring her back. But she's here, Nathaniel. Emily insisted, her voice breaking. She's not at peace. And until we figure out why, neither of us will be. Nathaniel's breath hitched, and for a moment, he looked like he might collapse under the weight of his own grief. He sank back into the chair, his face buried in his hands. I don't know what to do, he whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know how to help her. Emily felt a surge of compassion for him. For all his anger and defensiveness, he was just a broken man, drowning in his own guilt. She crossed the room slowly, kneeling beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. We'll figure it out, she said softly. Together. Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and full of sorrow. But what if there's nothing left to figure out? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. What if the reason she's still here is because of me? Emily's heart clenched. What do you mean? Nathaniel's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a long time, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet, she had to strain to hear it. Claire, she was struggling, he admitted, his voice shaking. More than I realized. She was angry all the time, but I thought it was just teenage rebellion. I didn't see how deep it went. I didn't see how alone she felt. Emily's stomach twisted with dread as he continued. The night before the accident, we had a fight, Nathaniel said, his hands trembling. She wanted to go to a party, but I told her no. We argued, screamed at each other. She said horrible things, and I told her she was just like her mother, that she was selfish, that she only thought about herself. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She could hear the raw pain in his voice, the regret that had been festering inside him for so long. That was the last thing I said to her, Nathaniel whispered, his voice breaking. The next day, she left for school, and I never saw her again. Emily closed her eyes, her heart aching for him. No wonder he had been drowning in guilt all these years. He had spent every moment replaying that argument, wishing he could take back those words. I failed her, Nathaniel said, his voice barely audible. I wasn't there when she needed me the most. And now she's trapped, because of me. Emily shook her head, her hand squeezing his arm. No, she said firmly. She's not trapped because of you, Nathaniel. You made mistakes, but you didn't cause this. There's something more, something we haven't uncovered yet. Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with desperation. But what if I can't save her? What if I've already lost her? Emily met his gaze, her own heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. You haven't lost her, she said softly. Not yet, but we need to figure out what really happened. We need to understand why she's still here. Nathaniel nodded slowly, the weight of his grief still heavy, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes now. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Emily stood, her resolve hardening. They had been avoiding the truth for too long. Now it was time to face it, no matter how painful. Let's go back to her room, she said. There's something in there. I'm sure of it. Nathaniel hesitated for only a moment before standing up, his expression grim but determined. All right, he said quietly. Let's go. Together, they walked down the dark hallway, the storm still raging outside. Emily's pulse quickened as they approached Claire's room, the door looming ahead like a portal to the past. This time, they weren't just searching for answers, they were seeking the truth. And whatever they found inside would change everything. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling as the rain battered the windows with relentless force. It was as if the mansion itself was bracing for the truth that was about to be uncovered. The walls creaking and groaning as Emily and Nathaniel made their way down the shadowy corridor toward Claire's room. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what they were about to face pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. Nathaniel walked beside her in silence, his expression grim, his eyes filled with the pain of reliving the past. Emily could feel the tension radiating from him, but she knew there was no turning back now. They had come too far. The ghost of Claire wasn't just a haunting presence, it was a cry for help. And somewhere, buried beneath the layers of guilt and grief, was the truth that had kept her spirit from finding peace. When they reached Claire's room, Emily hesitated, her hand resting on the door handle. She glanced at Nathaniel, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest, and they stepped inside. The room was just as Emily had left it the night before. Everything remained frozen in time. Claire's belongings untouched, her bed neatly made, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. But there was something different now, an energy in the room that made Emily's skin prickle with unease. It felt as though the room was waiting for them, as if it had been holding its breath, ready to reveal the secrets it had been hiding for so long. Nathaniel moved to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the familiar space. Emily stood by the door, her heart pounding, unsure of where to begin. She knew the answers were here. She could feel them. But how were they supposed to find them? Then she saw it. The mirror. It hung on the far wall, its surface fogged with dust once again. But this time, Emily felt drawn to it, a pull she couldn't explain. She crossed the room slowly, her footsteps soft against the floorboards, her eyes fixed on the glass. "This mirror," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Last night, I saw her in here." Nathaniel turned to face her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Emily reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. "I don't know how to explain it, but when I looked into it, she was standing behind me, just for a moment, and then she was gone." Nathaniel stared at the mirror, his face pale, his jaw clenched. "I've never noticed anything strange about the mirror," he said quietly, but there was uncertainty in his voice, as though he was questioning everything he thought he knew. Emily frowned, her hand tracing the edges of the frame. Something about the mirror felt wrong, out of place. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass, and that's when she noticed it, a small, almost invisible crack running along the bottom of the frame. It was so faint she hadn't seen it before, but now it caught her attention, glinting in the dim light. "There's something behind here," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel moved to her side, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the mirror. "Behind the mirror?" Emily nodded, her fingers pressing against the edges, searching for a way to remove it from the wall. "Help me," she said, her voice urgent. Together, they carefully lifted the mirror off its hooks, the weight of it heavier than they'd anticipated. As they set it down gently on the floor, Emily's breath caught in her throat. Behind the mirror was a small, hidden compartment, the wood paneling slightly ajar, as if someone had pried it open long ago. Nathaniel's face twisted with shock. "I never knew this was here." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the compartment, pulling the panel aside to reveal what was hidden inside. Her heart raced as her fingers brushed against something soft. Old, yellowed papers, folded neatly and tucked away as though they had been forgotten. She pulled them out, her hands shaking, and unfolded them slowly. It was a letter. Emily glanced at Nathaniel, who stood frozen beside her, his eyes wide with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The letter was addressed to Claire. Nathaniel's breath hitched as Emily began to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Claire, I know you'll never forgive me, but I can't keep living with this secret. I thought I was protecting you, but I was only protecting myself. I'm the reason you feel so lost, so angry, and I can't bear the weight of it any longer. You deserve the truth, even if it destroys everything." The words trailed off, and Emily's hands shook as she reached the end. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "Nathaniel," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Who wrote this?" Nathaniel's face was ashen, his eyes locked on the letter as if it were a ghost itself. I don't know," he stammered, but the guilt in his eyes told a different story. Emily felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. This wasn't just a random letter. It was a confession, and the fact that it had been hidden behind the mirror meant someone had been trying to keep the truth buried, someone who had been living in this house. She turned to Nathaniel, her heart pounding in her chest. "This letter, it's about Claire, isn't it? Whoever wrote this was confessing something. Something terrible." Nathaniel shook his head, his hands trembling as he took the letter from her, his eyes scanning the words again and again as if searching for some clue, some explanation. "I don't understand," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wrote this. I don't know who did." Emily watched him, her mind racing. "But you knew Claire was struggling," she pressed. "You knew she felt alone, like someone was keeping something from her." "Nathaniel, this letter. It explains everything. Claire didn't just feel abandoned. She felt betrayed." Nathaniel's face crumpled with anguish. "I failed her. I didn't see how much she was hurting. I should have." "Stop," Emily interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "This isn't just about your guilt. Whoever wrote this letter had a secret, something they never told Claire. And now, it's keeping her here. We need to figure out who wrote this." Nathaniel stared at the letter, his hands gripping the fragile paper as though it might disintegrate in his hands. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know who could have done this." Emily's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of the mystery. There was one person who had lived in this house, one person who had been closer to Claire than anyone else, closer than even Nathaniel. "Her mother," Emily whispered, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. "Nathaniel, could Claire's mother have written this? Could she have been hiding something from both of you?" Nathaniel looked at Emily, his eyes wide with shock. "Her mother left when Claire was a child," he said, his voice strained. "We hadn't spoken in years. She couldn't have." "Are you sure?" Emily pressed. "If her mother was the one who betrayed Claire, if she was keeping a secret that Claire never knew, that could be why Claire's spirit is still here. She's trying to understand what happened, trying to make sense of it all." Nathaniel stood in stunned silence, his mind reeling. "But why would she hide this letter?" Emily shook her head, her chest tight with the weight of the discovery. "Maybe she never meant for you or Claire to find it. Maybe she was trying to protect herself. Or maybe she thought she was protecting Claire." The storm outside intensified, the wind rattling the windows as if the house itself was reacting to the revelation. Emily looked at Nathaniel, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to find out the truth," she said softly. "It's the only way we can set Claire free." Nathaniel's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination as he nodded slowly, the weight of the truth settling over them both like a shroud. Together, they left the room, the letter clutched tightly in Nathaniel's hand. The truth was within reach, but they knew the final answer would change everything. About Claire's death, about the life Nathaniel had built on lies, and about the haunting presence that still lingered in the house. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. But as they prepared to confront the truth, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the darkest secret was still waiting to be uncovered. The house seemed to close in around them as Nathaniel and Emily left Claire's room. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the air was suffocating, thick with the weight of the secrets that had been unearthed. Nathaniel clutched the letter tightly in his hands, his knuckles white as they walked down the dark hallway toward his study. Emily could see the fear etched into his face, the realization that the truth he had been avoiding for so long was finally within reach. They stepped into the study, and Nathaniel immediately moved toward his desk, setting the letter down as if it were a bomb ready to explode. Emily watched him in silence for a moment, her mind racing with questions. If Claire's mother had written that letter, what had she been hiding? And more importantly, why had she left without telling Nathaniel or Claire the truth? Nathaniel turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and confusion. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "If this letter was meant for Claire, why did her mother never send it? Why did she leave us without saying a word?" Emily took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling as she tried to make sense of it all. "Maybe she was scared," she suggested, her voice steady. "Maybe she was hiding something so terrible that she couldn't face either of you. Whatever it was, it seems like Claire never knew the full truth." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "I thought I knew everything about her," he muttered. "But now I'm not sure I knew her at all." Emily stepped closer, her heart pounding. "The only way we'll find out is if we confront the past. There has to be something else, something that connects all of this. If her mother wrote that letter, maybe she left other clues behind." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes searching Emily's face as if seeking reassurance. But where do we look? Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the mystery. The letter had been hidden behind the mirror, and it was clear Claire's mother had been keeping secrets. But where else could those secrets be hidden? Suddenly, a thought struck her. Her belongings, Emily said, her voice urgent. Do you still have anything of Claire's mother? Something she might have left behind? Nathaniel's eyes widened as he realized what she was suggesting. There's a trunk, he said slowly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. In the attic. It's where I put everything after she left. I haven't opened it in years. Emily felt a surge of adrenaline. Then that's where we need to go. Together, they made their way up the narrow staircase to the attic. The air was colder here, the shadows deeper, and the house groaned under the weight of the storm as if it, too, sensed the gravity of what they were about to uncover. Nathaniel led the way, his flashlight casting flickering beams of light across the dust-covered boxes and old furniture that lined the attic floor. In the far corner, pushed against the wall, was the trunk. It was old and worn, the leather straps cracked with age. Nathaniel knelt in front of it, his hands trembling as he unlatched the locks. Emily stood beside him, her breath caught in her throat as he slowly lifted the lid. Inside, they found a collection of old photographs, letters, and personal belongings, remnants of a life long abandoned. Nathaniel sifted through them carefully, his fingers brushing over the faded pictures of him, Claire, and her mother, smiling together in happier times. But it wasn't the photographs that caught Emily's attention. It was a small, worn journal, tucked away at the bottom of the trunk. Nathaniel's hands froze as he pulled it out, his eyes widening. This is hers, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Claire's mother. Emily's heart raced as Nathaniel opened the journal, flipping through the pages. The entries were brief, scattered, but each one was filled with a raw, aching pain. Entries about feeling trapped in a marriage that had slowly crumbled, about secrets she could no longer bear to keep. And then, toward the end, they found the truth. I'm sorry, Claire. I've tried to live with this, but I can't anymore. You deserve to know the truth, even if it destroys everything. Nathaniel is not your father. The words struck Emily like a physical blow, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Nathaniel, whose face had gone deathly pale. He stared at the page, his hands shaking, his mind struggling to process what he was reading. Not her father? Nathaniel whispered, his voice hollow. That can't be. I raised her. I loved her. She was my daughter. Emily felt her heart ache for him, but the truth was undeniable. Claire's mother had been hiding this secret for years, a secret that had torn their family apart without Nathaniel even knowing it. And now, Claire's spirit was trapped, unable to move on because she had never learned the truth about her real father. Nathaniel's breathing became ragged, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the revelation crashed down on him. She died not knowing that I wasn't really her father. Emily stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. But you were her father, Nathaniel. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters. You were there for her, you loved her, and that's what she needed. Nathaniel shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. But I failed her. I never told her the truth because I didn't know. And now it's too late. Emily swallowed hard, her heart heavy with the realization that this was why Claire's spirit had lingered. She had been searching for answers, for the truth that had been kept from her all her life. And now, it was up to them to give her that closure. We need to go to her room, Emily said softly. We need to tell her the truth. They returned to Claire's room, the storm still raging outside as if nature itself was echoing the turmoil inside the house. Nathaniel held the journal tightly in his hands, the weight of the truth pressing down on him with every step. When they reached the room, Emily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the presence in the room, the same presence that had appeared in the mirror. Claire was here, waiting, and they needed to give her the answers she had been denied in life. Nathaniel stood in the center of the room, his face pale, his hands shaking as he opened the journal. Claire, he whispered, his voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I never knew the truth. I didn't know. that I wasn't your real father. Emily stood beside him, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for a sign. She could feel it, the energy shifting, the air growing colder. Claire was listening. Nathaniel's voice broke as he continued, his words thick with emotion. But I loved you. I loved you as my daughter, from the moment you were born. I would have done anything for you, Claire. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing down on them like a weight. Emily's chest tightened as she watched Nathaniel, her heart aching for the man who had carried this burden for so long. But then, slowly, she felt the air shift again. A faint sound, a whisper, barely audible, echoed through the room. And then, as if from nowhere, the laughter returned. It was soft, gentle, not the eerie sound they had heard before. It was filled with warmth, with a sense of peace. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. Claire wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She was forgiving. Nathaniel's tears fell freely now, his shoulders shaking as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The laughter faded, replaced by a deep, calming stillness. The cold air that had filled the room began to warm, the oppressive weight lifting as if a heavy shroud had been pulled away. And then, as if carried on the wind, a soft voice echoed through the room, so faint that Emily almost thought she had imagined it. "It's okay, Dad." Emily's breath hitched, her eyes widening as she looked at Nathaniel. He had heard it too. The final goodbye, the closure Claire had needed, the peace she had been searching for, had finally come. Nathaniel collapsed into the chair, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with sobs. Emily stood beside him, her heart full, her mind still reeling from the intensity of what had just happened. But she knew Claire was finally at peace. The storm outside began to ease, the wind dying down, the rain slowing to a gentle patter. The house, once filled with shadows and secrets, seemed lighter, as though the darkness had finally been chased away. Nathaniel looked up at Emily, his face streaked with tears, but there was something else in his eyes now, relief. "She's gone," he whispered. "She's free." Emily nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. "Yes, she is." They sat in silence for a long time. The weight of the past finally lifted. The truth had been painful, but it had set them both free. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.